So our next topic is going to be lenses. And in lenses, there's a few terms to kind of start with. We're going to go with focal length, which is the distance in millimeters from the focal plane of a camera, so our sensor in digital cameras, to the traditionally optical center, or the point in which light kind of flips inside of a lens. And so a lower number is a wider angle of view, and a higher number in millimeters is going to be more of a magnification, more of a zoom lens, giving us a smaller angle of view. Second thing is our lens speed. Lenses actually have nothing to do with speed. There's no shutter in it, so there's nothing having to do with time. But the idea is that if a lens has a really wide aperture, like we talked about in the last lecture, it allows more light in, and so you can use a shutter speed that captures less light. So a faster shutter speed essentially can be paired with a lens with a larger aperture capability. So it's called a faster lens, even though it really doesn't have anything to do with speed. So focal length in millimeters, here's just kind of an approximation of the angle of view. This is, again, keep in mind that it's the 35 millimeter full frame camera equivalent. So the higher the number, the less angle of view. Normal angle of view for human vision is about 50 millimeter angle of view. And here's a quick visual of what those might look like. So it's really magnification that we're talking about when we go to a higher number, is that we're zooming in, but we're just kind of getting closer, or we're literally not getting closer, but we're getting a view that is as if we were closer. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we're using a really wide angle lens, we end up with more distortion when we go to lower numbers. So traditionally, a portrait's taken with either an 80 millimeter-ish focal length or slightly higher. And you can really see the difference in here from the kind of out of whack proportions and distortion happening in the 19 millimeter versus kind of being more normal feeling in the 70 millimeter. But that's even just a little bit wider, and things are just kind of a little less balanced, less accurate, I suppose, to real life as we would normally feel that they'd be. Whereas higher than 70 millimeter is going to end up flattening things, which in a portrait typically isn't a problem. But in some cases, it makes you have a more detached feeling if you are at a significantly higher focal length. So anyway, this is why you need a selfie stick, is to get your camera at least a certain distance away from you so you don't get too much distortion. And that kind of goes along with the idea of this quote by Robert Capa, a famous war photographer and photojournalist. If your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. In other words, use your feet, get closer to things. You don't want to have a detached feel if you want your viewer to really kind of connect to your photos. So instead of photographing from as far away as you're naturally comfortable, get a little uncomfortable, get closer, get to where you can use a wider angle, where you can show more depth in your images, where the viewer will actually really connect well. Now, one note that I like to say is that Robert Capa, and I don't remember what war he was photographing, but he ended up taking a bullet in battle and died on the battlefield. So at the same time, don't push your comfort level to the point where you're really truly unsafe. All right, so 3 things affect depth of field. We already talked about the first one in the last PowerPoint being the aperture, but focal length being a more magnified or higher number versus lower will affect your depth of field. And that is really when you are using a longer lens, you get a shallower depth of field. Whereas if you're using a real wide angle, like a 17 millimeter, you probably don't have any depth of field problems at all. Everything will be pretty much in sharp focus, unless you're really close to it. And then that is our third item, is your camera to subject distance. So when you're really close to things, you end up with compression. And so your depth of field gets smaller, it gets compressed as well. Whereas when you are further away, more things become in that range of depth of field because you have more distance in order to have a larger depth of field. Here's some visual representations of that. Your larger and smaller aperture, your longer and shorter focal length lens, and your closer and further distance. Another thing I should note is that the middle one, the Tombstone, is a closer distance and further distance as well, but I think you get the idea. In relation to depth of field, it's important to keep in mind that your range of depth of field is not symmetrical. You end up with about a third of the range of depth of field of what's in focus in front and 2/3 being behind. So it's really important to remember that if you have a really distracting background, for example, it's harder to get more blur behind your subject than it is fairly easy to get more blur or less in focus in front of your subject. All right, and then a few things relating to lenses that you may notice, but are maybe of less significance, but if you see them, you'll kind of know what they're caused by. So chromatic aberration, this is kind of based on the idea of a lens is basically a curved piece of glass, kind of like a prism. It does bend light. It does separate, the whole spectrum more RGB. And so your red color and your violet colors kind of get focused at different points. And we don't normally notice this in a photo, but what happens is sometimes when you have a really high contrast scene, something being fairly backlit particularly, you end up with a fringe, they call it chromatic aberration, on the sides of your photo. So if you ever see something, and I'll show you a visual here, like this, where you get a little kind of colored halo, that's chromatic aberration. And there are actually ways to fix this easily in post-production. But the easiest way to fix it is, instead of, I'm gonna go back a slide, instead of using the full width of our lens, where, I don't know if you can quite get this idea, but the sides of our lens curve more than the center of our lens, right? And so if you use your aperture and stop down a few stops, you block off the top and the bottom, at least in this illustration, of your lens, and making it so that the light only comes through the more flat parts of the lens. So therefore, you'd be able to reduce your chromatic aberration by doing that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have to keep in mind that our lenses aperture are made out of metal blades typically, and they make a circle of some sort. And some of them, like this top left illustration, and I guess the bottom left illustration, have something like 17 different blades, whereas the right-hand side are more like probably 9 or 11 blades. And so those apertures, when they are open, are pretty much circles either way, because they're kind of curved blades. But when you start stopping them down, if you have more blades, you end up with a more perfect circle as opposed to something more octagon-like in the illustrations on the right. And so that's going to focus things better if it's a more circular diaphragm, aperture opening versus one that's more rectangular. So here is a visual example of like a cropped in image on a lens that is frankly cheaper and has less blades and gives more of an octagon shape. And so you end up with the image being fairly sharp on the top left and kind of going, oh, it's fine at f8, f11, f22, but come f32 and particularly 45, which most lenses don't go up that high, so maybe that's not the best number to have there. But you start getting a softer image because you're getting a less perfect circle. So the real important thing here is to know that you shouldn't really necessarily use either end of the spectrum on aperture if you want a really sharp picture. Now, if it's the difference between getting, the right picture versus one that is tack sharp versus having a little chromatic aberration or having a little diffraction here, chances are for this class, we're not going to be zooming in incredibly, and we're not going to notice the fine details of this. But traditionally, it's thought of as the sweet spot for any lens is 2 stops from all the way open. That's where you're not going to have a cheap lens having diffraction caused by the irregular circle, and you're not going to get as much chromatic aberration problems. So 2 stops from all the way open on a main lens is usually the sweet spot. All right, somewhat related in topic to lenses at least is hyperfocal distance. So hyperfocal distance is the nearest distance on a lens with a certain configuration that you can focus and also include infinity. So this is really important for the landscape photographers. They want to know, well, what's the nearest rock I can actually focus on, or I want to get my whole scene in sharp focus and show every detail. So there are actually phone calculators for this, where you can just pull up what camera you have, what lens you have, put in what aperture you want to use, and it'll tell you what the closest distance you can focus and still get infinity, and you don't even have to think about it then. So that's handy, particularly if you're a landscape photographer. Okay, now we're sort of balancing out with a couple other details. Camera shake. Camera shake is definitely a problem for most beginners. And camera shake is really caused, or causes blur when you end up with a shutter speed that is a little too slow to handhold a camera. So students always say, well, how do I know what shutter speed I can work with in order to get a sharp picture handholding it? Because most students don't like to do their, to carry around a big heavy tripod, basically. I recommend you invest in a good quality tripod that's light, but usually the lighter ones are more expensive. So let's go into this. This is, let's say we have a focal length. And the traditional measurement for this is that you want a shutter speed that is equal to or higher in number than your focal length. So if I have a 28mm focal length, I go to a 30th of a second shutter speed. The higher number focal length, the faster shutter speed you have to use to balance that out. An idea with this, if you kind of hold your hands out to your side or kind of to the edge of your eye vision and you move back and forth, you end up with, say, 10% of your camera shaking or your angle of view shaking. If you pull your fingers to be, say, 6 or 8 inches apart and you do that same amount of movement, you're moving the entire frame. It's not, staying within the same area, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the smaller angle of view you have, the more camera shake you're going to see. So therefore, higher shutter speed. Okay, a couple of other things. I think I talked about this in a previous one, a previous lecture, but a UV filter is always a great idea, always great for protecting your camera lens. Very cheap, and it's just pretty much a clear piece of glass that blocks out UV light. But there's 2 other filters I like to talk about, which are polarizing filters and neutral density filters. So polarizing filter cuts out reflections in glass typically, as well as atmospheric haze. So it's really good for photographing, this sounds creepy, but through windows. Or if you're a landscape photographer, if you don't want to have the smog from the city, you want to cut down on that, it'll help with that. Keep in mind that it does not work on reflections from metal. So like reflection in the hood of a car, it won't eliminate that, but it does for glass. And then a neutral density filter is something that a lot of other students like to get. Again, you don't need these, but in case you want to try them, these are kind of the most basic starter places or starter filters. So neutral density filter is kind of like a welding mask. It just darkens your scene. And most people go, well, why would I want my scene darker? Well, so the idea with that is that if you put your camera on a tripod and you have a filter on, it gives you less light coming in. It increases your shutter speed. So you end up with a 1/2 second or a 1 second shutter speed. You've probably seen pictures of like waterfalls where they can be like sharp frozen. You can see all the droplets of the water coming down versus like a sort of just blur of water. And that's what they're using is a neutral density filter to increase the time so you get more blur and whatever's moving in the scene. Okay, this is the point where I normally go into the camera simulator. So there's a link in D2L right below this PowerPoint for the camera simulator page. It sometimes needs to be reloaded. There now is a like paid version versus a free version. You only get a couple of tries. I want to say 5 or 10 with the free version, but it's a simulator where you essentially can. There's this scene of a little girl holding up a little toy windmill at a park, and you can change the aperture, the shutter speed, and those other sorts of controls, and see what effect they're going to have on the picture when you do manipulate different things in the camera. So check it out, and hopefully this will kind of be a good simulator before you go out with a real camera. I'll also have some other videos of me doing a demo, but check it out.